The roaring waters swallowed everything in their path, as Eliza Morgan clutched desperately to the rickety wooden post of what had been her front porch just hours before. The spring of 1875 had brought the heaviest rains anyone in Willow Creek, Colorado, had ever seen, turning the normally placid river that wound through the valley into a raging torrent that had already claimed 3 homesteads upstream from hers. "Help!" She screamed again, her voice growing hoarse from calling into the howling wind. The water had risen to her waist now, the current tugging relentlessly at her sodden skirts. At 22, Eliza had survived drought, blizzards, and the loss of her parents to influenza 2 winters past. But nothing had prepared her for this furious deluge that threatened to sweep away everything she'd fought to keep. She cast another frantic glance toward the hills, searching for any sign of movement. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away, and with the roads washed out, she had little hope of rescue. The water climbed higher, now reaching her ribs, its icy grip stealing her breath and numbing her fingers where they clung to the post. Just as the current tugged harder and her grip began to slip, Eliza heard the distant sound of hoofbeats, somehow cutting through the roar of the flood and the pounding rain. She twisted her head, blinking water from her eyes, and saw a figure on horseback galloping along the ridge above the floodwaters, a silhouette against the angry gray sky. "Here!" she cried, summoning the last of her strength to wave one arm frantically above her head. "Please, over here!" The rider spotted her and immediately changed course, guiding the powerful bay horse down the hillside with expert precision. As they drew closer, Eliza could make out a tall man in a weather-beaten hat, his duster billowing behind him like wings as he urged his horse directly into the swirling floodwaters without hesitation. "Hold on." His deep voice carried across the water as he navigated through the current, the horse snorting and fighting against the flow. "Just hold on." Preston Cole had been riding fence lines on the northern boundary of his ranch when he spotted the rising waters in the valley below. He'd immediately turned toward town, intending to warn anyone in the path of the flood, when he'd caught sight of the woman clinging to what remained of a homestead being devoured by the raging river. He leaned forward in his saddle, murmuring encouragement to his horse, Samson, as they pushed deeper into the flood. The water reached the animal's chest now, but the seasoned cow horse kept moving forward, responding to Preston's guidance with the trust born of years working together. "I'm coming," he called to the woman, whose pale face seemed to float above the churning brown water. Her dark hair hung in sodden ropes around her shoulders, and even from this distance, he could see she was trembling violently. Preston urged Samson closer, fighting the current that threatened to sweep them both downstream. When he was within arm's reach of her, he stretched out his hand. "Take my hand, quick now." Eliza reached for him, her numb fingers missing his grasp on the first attempt. The second time, their hands connected, and his strong fingers closed around her wrist in a grip that promised safety. "I've got you," he said, his blue eyes meeting hers with steady determination. "Let go of the post." It took all her courage to release her lifeline, but the moment she did, he pulled with surprising strength, hauling her through the water and up onto his horse in one fluid motion. She landed awkwardly across his lap, gasping and coughing. "Hold onto me," Preston instructed, guiding her arms around his waist as he turned Samson toward higher ground. "Don't let go." Eliza clung to him, feeling the solid warmth of his body against her freezing one as they began the treacherous journey back through the floodwaters. The horse fought valiantly against the current, its powerful muscles straining beneath them. "My house," Eliza gasped against his shoulder. "Everything I have houses can be rebuilt," Preston replied, his voice firm but gentle. Lives can't. They reached the edge of the flood zone, Samson scrambling up the muddy bank to safety. Only then did Preston slow their pace, allowing the exhausted horse to catch its breath as they continued toward higher ground. Eliza shivered violently against him, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. Without a word, Preston shrugged out of his duster and wrapped it around her shoulders, keeping one arm securely around her waist to steady her in the saddle. "My ranch is just over that ridge," he said, nodding toward the hills ahead. "We'll get you warm and dry there." "Thank you," she managed through chattering teeth. "I thought I was going to die." He glanced down at her, his expression softening slightly beneath the brim of his hat. "Not on my watch, madam. Not today." "Eliza," she offered, needing him to know her name, to know she was more than just another victim of the flood. "Eliza Morgan." "Preston Cole," he replied with a slight nod. "Most folks just call me Prees." As they crested the ridge, Eliza caught sight of a substantial ranch house nestled in a protected valley, with several outbuildings and corrals spreading out around it. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth that seemed impossibly distant to her frozen body. "My foreman and a couple of hands are there," Preston explained as they approached. "They'll help us get word to town about the flooding." True to his word, the moment they rode into the yard, two men emerged from the barn, immediately rushing to help when they saw Eliza's condition. "Frank, go stoke up the fire," Preston ordered as he dismounted and reached up to lift Eliza from the saddle. "Tom, take care of Samson, then ride to town and warn Sheriff Davies about the flooding in the valley. Tell him the Morgan place is gone, and likely the Hendersons too." Eliza tried to stand on her own when her feet touched the ground, but her legs buckled beneath her. Preston caught her before she fell, sweeping her into his arms without hesitation. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "You can barely stand," he countered, already carrying her toward the house. "Save your strength." The warmth of the ranch house enveloped her the moment they stepped inside. It was a surprisingly comfortable home, with solid furniture and a few unexpected touches that spoke of care and attention: braided rugs on the wooden floors, curtains at the windows, and bookshelves lined with volumes. Preston carried her directly to the large stone fireplace where his foreman was building up the flames. "Frank, find Mrs. Patterson. Tell her we need dry clothes and hot tea." "Yes, boss," the man replied, hurrying from the room. Preston set Eliza down gently in a chair before the fire, then knelt to remove her mud-caked boots. His hands were large but surprisingly gentle as he worked. "You're shaking like an aspen leaf," he said, concern evident in his voice. "We need to get you out of these wet clothes before you catch your death." "I'll manage," Eliza insisted, though her fingers were too numb to work the buttons of her dress. A middle-aged woman appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern when she saw Eliza. "Mercy, what happened?" "Flooding in the valley, Mrs. Patterson," Preston explained, standing to make way for the housekeeper. "Miss Morgan here nearly got swept away with her home." "You poor dear," Mrs. Patterson said, already assessing the situation with practical efficiency. "Let's get you upstairs and into something dry." With the housekeeper's help, Eliza managed to climb the stairs to a guest bedroom, where Mrs. Patterson assisted her out of her sodden clothing and into a flannel nightgown and thick woolen robe. "These will be too big," the housekeeper apologized, "but they are warm and dry. They belonged to Mr. Cole's sister when she used to visit." "Thank you," Eliza murmured, still shivering despite the dry clothes. The reality of what had happened, what she had lost, was beginning to sink in. Her home, her parents' home, was gone. The garden where her mother had taught her to tend vegetables, the porch where her father had told stories on summer evenings, the small chest containing her few precious mementos, all washed away in the muddy floodwaters. Mrs. Patterson seemed to sense her distress. "There now," she said gently, guiding Eliza back downstairs. "A hot meal and some tea will help. You're safe now, and that's what matters most." Preston was waiting by the fire, having changed into dry clothes himself. He turned when they entered, his eyes quickly assessing Eliza's condition. "Better?" he asked. She nodded, though tears threatened to spill over. "Yes, thank you. Sit here by the fire," he urged, guiding her to an armchair. "Mrs. Patterson makes the best beef stew west of the Mississippi, and it's just what you need to warm up from the inside out." The housekeeper disappeared into the kitchen, leaving them alone by the crackling fire. For a moment, neither spoke, the only sounds the popping of the logs and the distant howl of the wind outside. "I don't know how to thank you," Eliza finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You saved my life." Preston shook his head slightly. "Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," she replied. "You did." He met her eyes then, and something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or simply the shared experience of having faced death together and emerged on the other side. "Your home," he said after a moment. "Was it just you living there?" Eliza nodded, grateful for the practical question that distracted her from her emotions. "Yes, my parents passed 2 winters ago. The place was mine." "No husband, family nearby?" "No husband," she confirmed. "No family at all, really. Just neighbors, though the closest is the Henderson place, and from what you said—" "We don't know for certain," Preston said quickly. "Tom will bring back news from town." Mrs. Patterson returned with a tray bearing 2 steaming bowls of stew and a pot of tea. The rich, savory aroma made Eliza's stomach growl, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since early morning. "Eat," the housekeeper instructed. "Both of you. I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything else." They ate in companionable silence, the hearty stew doing exactly as promised, warming Eliza from the inside out. As the chill finally began to leave her bones, exhaustion took its place. She found herself struggling to keep her eyes open. Preston noticed immediately. "You should rest," he said, taking her empty bowl. "You've been through an ordeal." "I don't want to impose," she began, but he cut her off with a shake of his head. "You're not imposing. You'll stay here until we figure out what's next. The guest room is yours for as long as you need it." His tone brooked no argument, and truthfully, Eliza had no energy to protest. Where else could she go? Her home was gone, her possessions lost to the flood. The stark reality of her situation hit her anew, and this time she couldn't hold back the tears that spilled down her cheeks. Preston looked momentarily alarmed at her distress, then his expression softened. Without a word, he moved to sit beside her, offering a clean handkerchief from his pocket. "I'm sorry," she managed between quiet sobs. "It's just hit me that everything is gone." "Not everything," he said quietly. "You're still here. That's what matters most." Eliza dabbed at her eyes, embarrassed by her breakdown in front of this man she barely knew. "You must think me terribly weak." "On the contrary," Preston replied, surprising her. "I think you must be remarkably strong to have survived on your own after losing your parents, running a homestead single-handed. And today, you held on when many would have let go." His words, spoken with such simple conviction, steadied her. She took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. "You're right, I'm alive, and that's not nothing." "It's everything," he corrected gently. Before she could respond, the sound of horses in the yard drew their attention. Preston moved to the window, peering out into the gathering dusk. "It's Tom," he said, "and it looks like he's brought company." He strode to the door, opening it to admit his ranch hand and 2 other men, one wearing a sheriff's badge, the other dressed in the somber attire of a doctor. "Miss Morgan," the sheriff said, removing his hat as he entered. "Glad to see you safe. When the Hendersons reported you hadn't evacuated with the rest of the valley, we feared the worst." "The Hendersons are safe?" Eliza asked, hope flaring in her chest. "Yes, madam. They got out early this morning when the water first started rising. They're staying at the church in town with the other families who had to evacuate." Relief washed through her. At least she wasn't the only survivor. "Doc's here to make sure you're not suffering any ill effects from your ordeal," Preston explained, gesturing the doctor forward. The examination was brief but thorough. "Some bruising and minor cuts," the doctor pronounced. "And you're chilled to the bone, but I don't see any signs of serious injury. Rest and warmth are what you need most, young lady." "That's what I told her," Preston said, the hint of a smile tugging at his lips. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Miss Morgan, I hate to ask this now, but do you have somewhere to go? The church is taking in flood victims, but it's getting mighty crowded." Before Eliza could respond, Preston spoke up. "She'll stay here until her place can be rebuilt or other arrangements made." The sheriff raised an eyebrow but nodded. "That's mighty generous of you, Cole." "It's the decent thing to do," Preston replied simply. After the visitors departed, promising to return with news when the floodwaters receded, Mrs. Patterson helped Eliza upstairs to the guest room. The bed was turned down, with extra quilts piled at the foot, and a small fire burned in the grate. "Mr. Cole is a good man," the housekeeper said as she helped Eliza into bed. "Lost his parents young, same as you, built this place up from almost nothing. He understands what it means to start over." Eliza sank into the softness of the mattress, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. "He saved my life today," she murmured. Mrs. Patterson smiled knowingly. "That's just his way. Always been one to ride toward trouble instead of away from it." She tucked the quilts around Eliza with maternal care. "Rest now. Tomorrow will be soon enough to worry about what comes next." As the housekeeper closed the door behind her, Eliza stared up at the unfamiliar ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. In the space of a single day, she had lost her home and nearly her life, only to be rescued by a stranger who now offered shelter without hesitation. Preston Cole. The name echoed in her mind as sleep began to claim her. A man who had ridden into raging floodwaters to save someone he didn't know. A man who spoke little but acted decisively. A man whose blue eyes had held hers with such steady assurance that she had trusted him instantly. Her last conscious thought before drifting off was to wonder what kind of man he truly was, this cowboy who had pulled her from the rising waters and brought her to safety. Dawn broke clear and crisp the next morning, the storm having blown itself out overnight. Eliza woke disoriented, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar room until memory flooded back the rising waters, her desperate grip on the porch post, the powerful horse plunging through the flood with its determined rider. She rose and dressed in clothes Mrs. Patterson had left for her a simple skirt and blouse that must have belonged to Preston's sister. They fit well enough, though the sleeves were slightly too long. After washing her face and arranging her hair as best she could without proper pins or combs, she made her way downstairs. The house was quiet, though she could smell coffee brewing somewhere nearby. Following her nose, she found the kitchen, where Mrs. Patterson was kneading bread dough on a floured table. "Good morning, dear," the housekeeper greeted her warmly. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Eliza admitted. "Where is everyone?" Mr. Cole and the hands rode out at first light to check on the other homesteads in the valley and assess the damage. "He said to tell you to make yourself at home and that he'd be back by midday." Eliza felt a pang of guilt at the thought of Preston riding out to help others after already doing so much for her. "Is there something I can do to help here? I'm not one for sitting idle. Mrs. Patterson smiled approvingly. There's always work to be done. If you're feeling up to it, you could help me with these preserves I'm putting up. The berry harvest was good this year, and what doesn't get preserved will spoil. Grateful for the distraction, Eliza rolled up her sleeves and set to work alongside the housekeeper. The familiar tasks of washing, sorting, and preparing the berries for preserving kept her hands busy and her mind from dwelling too much on all she had lost. As they worked, Mrs. Patterson shared stories about the ranch and its owner. Preston had inherited the land from his uncle 12 years ago, when he was just 23. It had been little more than a run-down cabin and a few head of cattle then, but through hard work and smart management, he'd built it into one of the most successful operations in the county. "Never married?" Eliza asked, trying to sound merely conversational. Mrs. Patterson's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. "No. There was a girl in town he courted for a while about 5 years back. Margaret Willoughby, the banker's daughter, but nothing came of it." She paused, considering her next words. "Mr. Cole keeps to himself mostly. Some folks in town think him standoffish, but he's just private. And busy running a ranch this size doesn't leave much time for socializing." By midday, they had filled dozens of jars with preserves, and the kitchen was warm and fragrant with the sweet smell of berries. Eliza was just helping to clean up when the sound of horses announced Preston's return. He entered through the back door, removing his hat and gloves. His face was grave, but it lightened slightly when he saw Eliza standing by the stove. "Miss Morgan," he greeted her. "You're looking better today." "I feel better," she replied. "Thanks to your hospitality." He nodded acknowledgement, then accepted the cup of coffee Mrs. Patterson pressed into his hands. "The flooding was extensive," he reported. "The entire lower valley is underwater still, though the river has stopped rising. Your place—" He hesitated, clearly reluctant to deliver bad news. "It's gone, isn't it?" Eliza asked quietly. Preston met her eyes directly. "Yes, the foundation stones are still there, but the structure itself was carried downstream. I'm sorry." Though she had expected it, the confirmation still hit her hard. Eliza sank into a kitchen chair, trying to absorb the finality of it. "What about the other homesteads? The Hendersons' place is damaged but standing. The Wilsons lost their barn but saved their house. The Packards weren't so lucky, their place is gone too." He took a sip of coffee. "The town's organizing relief efforts. The church will continue housing folks who can't return home, and there's talk of a building B once the waters recede enough to access the valley again." "That's something, at least," Eliza said, grasping at this small hope. Community barn raisings and house buildings were common in the West, where neighbors depended on each other for survival. With help, she might be able to rebuild. "There's something else," Preston said, setting down his cup. "I rode by your place specifically. Managed to recover a few things that washed up on higher ground." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, mud-caked wooden box. Eliza recognized it immediately, her mother's jewelry box, which had sat on the small table beside her bed. With trembling hands, she took it from him, carefully opening the tarnished brass latch. Inside, miraculously dry thanks to the tight-fitting lid, were her mother's wedding ring, a cameo brooch, and a locket containing tiny portraits of her parents. "How did you know?" she whispered, tears welling in her eyes as she traced a finger over the precious mementos. "I didn't," Preston admitted, "but I know what it's like to lose everything. Sometimes it's the small things that matter most." Impulsively, Eliza reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you. This means more than I can say." For a moment, he seemed startled by the contact, but then his larger hand closed gently around hers. "You're welcome." Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat, breaking the moment. "Lunch is ready if you're hungry, Mr. Cole." They ate a simple meal of cold ham, fresh bread, and some of the preserves they'd made that morning. Preston told them more about the situation in the valley and the plans for recovery. "The sheriff's organizing work parties to clear debris once it's safe," he explained. "With enough hands, rebuilding could start within a few weeks." "I don't know if I can afford to rebuild," Eliza admitted. "The farm barely provided enough to live on as it was." Preston considered her words. "What will you do?" It was the question she'd been avoiding since waking. "I'm not sure. I could try to find work in town. Mrs. Wilson mentioned once that she might need help in her millinery shop." "Or you could stay here," Preston suggested, his tone carefully neutral. "At least until you decide. We can always use another pair of hands, especially with preserving season upon us." Mrs. Patterson has been saying for years she could use some help. The housekeeper nodded enthusiastically. "Indeed I could. The offer's genuine, Miss Morgan, if you're willing. Room and board plus wages." Eliza was stunned by the offer. I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Mrs. Patterson urged. "At least for now. You need time to sort things out and we need the help." Looking from the housekeeper's kind face to Preston's more guarded one, Eliza made her decision. "Yes, then. Thank you, I accept, at least until I can figure out my next steps." Something like relief flickered across Preston's features before he nodded and rose from the table. "Good. That's settled then. I need to check on the south pasture. The hands reported some fencing down after the storm." After he left, Mrs. Patterson began clearing the table, humming softly to herself. "He doesn't say much," she remarked, "but he means what he does say. You'll be all right here, Miss Morgan." "Eliza, please," she insisted. "If we're to be working together, there's no need for formality." The housekeeper smiled. "Eliza it is, then. And I'm Martha to my friends." That afternoon, Martha showed Eliza around the house and explained her duties. The work wouldn't be difficult, helping with cooking and preserving, keeping the house tidy, mending, and occasionally assisting with the accounts, as Martha's eyesight wasn't what it used to be. "Mr. Cole takes his meals regular," Martha explained. "Breakfast at dawn, dinner at noon, supper at 6. He's not particular about what's served, but he does appreciate good cooking." "Does he entertain often?" Eliza asked, trying to build a clearer picture of the man who had saved her life. Martha chuckled. "Hardly ever. The occasional business associate or neighboring rancher, but he's not one for social gatherings. Christmas is about the only time the house sees real company, when he hosts a dinner for the hands and their families." By evening, Eliza had settled into her new role enough to help prepare supper, a hearty beef stew with dumplings and apple pie for dessert. Preston returned as the sun was setting, bringing with him the earthy scents of horses and open air. He cleaned up before joining them at the table, his dark hair still damp from washing. Eliza noticed how the simple act of removing his hat and gun belt seemed to transform him slightly, softening the hard edges of the cowboy into something more approachable. "Mrs. Patterson tells me you've agreed to stay on for a while," he said as Martha served the stew. "Yes," Eliza confirmed. "I'm grateful for the opportunity." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "The work's not too hard and you'll have time to consider your options. The offer to help rebuild your place stands, whenever you decide that's what you want." "That's very generous," Eliza said, wondering why this man she barely knew was so determined to help her. As if reading her thoughts, Preston added, "The valley looks out for its own. You'd do the same if positions were reversed." The meal passed pleasantly, with Martha carrying most of the conversation. Eliza learned that Preston had grown up in Missouri, the son of a horse trader, and had come west with his uncle after his parents died in a typhoid outbreak. He'd been just 16 then, working as a cowhand on various ranches before inheriting his uncle's modest spread. "And you?" Preston asked, turning the conversation to her. "How did you come to be living alone on a homestead in Willow Creek Valley?" Eliza told him about her parents' decision to leave their struggling farm in Nebraska and stake a claim in Colorado 7 years ago. How they'd built the small house with their own hands, how her father had taught her about crops and livestock while her mother ensured she maintained the education she'd begun back east. "They had such dreams for the place," she said wistfully. "Mother's garden was just starting to truly flourish this year. The apple trees my father planted were finally bearing fruit." "Trees can be replanted," Preston said quietly. "Gardens receded." "Yes," she agreed, meeting his gaze across the table. "They can." After supper, Preston excused himself to his study to work on the ranch accounts, while Martha showed Eliza to a small sitting room where a basket of mending awaited attention. The domesticity of the evening sitting by lamplight with needle and thread brought an unexpected sense of comfort after the chaos of the previous day. The days fell into a pattern after that. Eliza rose early, helping Martha prepare breakfast before Preston and the ranch hands began their day. Mornings were spent on household tasks: cleaning, baking, preserving the bounty from the kitchen garden. Afternoons often found her helping with mending or accompanying Martha to the henhouse to collect eggs. Preston was usually absent during daylight hours, riding out with the hands to check on cattle, repair fencing, or attend to the 1,000 other tasks that running a successful ranch required. But he returned each evening, washing away the dust of the day before joining them for supper, where conversation gradually became easier as they grew more comfortable with one another. A week passed, then 2. News from town confirmed that the floodwaters were receding, though the valley remained muddy and impassable in many places. The Building B for the Packards' new home was scheduled to begin the following week, and plans were underway for Eliza's place after that. She found herself oddly conflicted about the prospect. Part of her was eager to reclaim her independence, to rebuild what she had lost. But another part had grown comfortable at the Cole ranch, appreciating the security it offered, and though she was reluctant to admit it even to herself, enjoying the brief moments of conversation with Preston each day. On a warm afternoon in late May, nearly 3 weeks after the flood, Eliza was hanging laundry in the yard when she spotted Preston riding in, leading a second horse, a pretty sorrel mare with a white blaze down her face. "Afternoon, Miss Morgan," he greeted her, dismounting with fluid grace. "Thought you might like to ride out and see your place. The road's passable now, and you should know what you're facing before the Building B starts." Eliza glanced down at her work dress, hesitating. "I'm not dressed for riding." "Martha can lend you a split skirt," he suggested. "Unless you'd rather wait for another day." "No," she decided quickly. "I'd like to go. Give me a few minutes to change." True to his word, Martha provided a serviceable riding skirt, and soon Eliza was mounted on the sorrel mare, following Preston down the trail that led toward the valley. The mare copper, Preston called her, was gentle and responsive, clearly well trained. "She's lovely," Eliza commented as they rode side by side along a ridge overlooking the valley. "One of your breeding stock," Preston nodded. "Foaled her 3 years ago." "She's got good lines, steady temperament, sound legs." "You have a way with horses," Eliza observed. "I noticed it with Samson during the flood. He trusted you completely, even in those dangerous waters." A ghost of a smile touched Preston's lips. "Horses are straightforward. Treat them well, they respond in kind. No guesswork like with people. You find people so complicated? She asked, curious about this glimpse into his thinking. He glanced at her, then back at the trail. Some more than others. They rode in companionable silence after that, Eliza taking in the beauty of the landscape. The spring rains had turned the hillsides emerald green, dotted with wildflowers in purple, yellow, and white. Despite the destruction in the valley below, nature was renewing itself all around them. As they descended into the valley, evidence of the flood became more apparent. Debris caught in tree branches marked how high the waters had risen. Felled trees and sections of fencing lay scattered across fields. The road itself was still muddy in places, requiring careful navigation. When they crested the final rise overlooking Eliza's property, she drew Copper to a halt, her breath catching in her throat. The devastation was complete. Where her neat little house had stood was nothing but the stone foundation and a few scattered timbers. The barn was gone entirely. The garden was buried under a layer of silt and debris. "Oh," she whispered, dismay washing through her. Preston stopped beside her, giving her time to absorb the scene. "The foundation's solid," he said after a moment. "That's something to build on." Eliza nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Everything she and her parents had worked for, everything they had built together, reduced to mud and scattered lumber. "Would you like to go down?" Preston asked gently. She nodded again, nudging Copper forward. They picked their way carefully down the slope to what remained of the homestead. When they reached the foundation, Preston dismounted and helped Eliza down, his strong hands spanning her waist as he lifted her effortlessly from the saddle. Up close, the destruction was even more apparent. Mud covered everything, and the few possessions that remained were damaged beyond salvaging. Eliza walked slowly around what had been her home, occasionally stooping to touch a familiar item, a bent cooking pot, the broken frame of a chair, a sodden book whose pages had fused together. Preston followed at a respectful distance, allowing her this time to mourn what was lost. When she finally stopped at the edge of what had been her mother's garden, he moved to stand beside her. "We could mark the corners of the house," he suggested. "Take measurements for the rebuilding." Eliza turned to look at him, struck by his use of we rather than you. "You don't have to help with this," she said. "You've already done so much." "I want to," he replied simply. Something in his steady gaze made her heart flutter strangely. "Why?" she asked before she could stop herself. Preston looked away, his eyes scanning the devastated landscape. "Because no one should face this alone." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. On impulse, Eliza reached out and laid her hand on his arm. "Thank you, not just for today, but for everything." He covered her hand with his own, the warmth of his touch seeping through her glove. "You're welcome." They spent the next hour taking measurements and making notes for the rebuilding. Preston's practical knowledge proved invaluable, as he pointed out improvements that could be made to the original design, a more secure roof anchoring, windows positioned to catch the morning light, a deeper root cellar for better storage. "You know a great deal about building," Eliza remarked as they prepared to leave. "Had to learn," he replied with a shrug. "Built most of the outbuildings at the ranch myself with help from the hands. Expanded the main house too." As they mounted up to return to the ranch, Eliza took one last look at her devastated homestead. Rather than the overwhelming despair she had felt upon first seeing it, she now felt a stirring of determination. With Preston's help, she could rebuild. It would be different, but perhaps better in some ways. The ride back was quieter, each lost in their own thoughts. As the ranch came into view, Preston broke the silence. "The Building B is scheduled for next Saturday," he said. "I've donated lumber from my stand of pines for your place. Should be enough for the frame and roof at least." Eliza was stunned by his generosity. "Preston, that's too much. I can't accept—" "You can and you will," he interrupted firmly. "It's not charity, it's what neighbors do." She wanted to argue further but recognized the stubborn set of his jaw. "Then I'll find a way to repay you." "No need," he said as they rode into the yard. "Consider it an investment in keeping a good neighbor in the valley." Later that evening, after Preston had retired to his study, Eliza helped Martha with the dishes, her mind still on the day's revelations. "He's a generous man," she commented, drying a plate and setting it on the shelf. Martha nodded knowingly. "Always has been, though he doesn't make a show of it. When the Wilsons lost their crop to hail 3 summers back, a mysterious donation of seed appeared just in time for replanting. When the schoolhouse needed a new roof, the materials showed up overnight." "He doesn't want recognition," Eliza observed. "No," Martha agreed. "Makes him uncomfortable. His father was the same way, from what his uncle used to say. Believed a man's actions spoke louder than his words or his reputation." Eliza thought about that as she finished her chores and prepared for bed. Preston Cole was not what she had initially assumed, not just a taciturn rancher who happened to be in the right place at the right time to save her from the flood. There were depths to him that intrigued her, layers of compassion and principle beneath the reserved exterior. As she drifted off to sleep, she found herself wondering what it might be like to truly know the man who had rescued her, to be more than just a neighbor he had helped, more than just an employee in his household. The thought should have alarmed her, but instead it brought a smile to her lips as sleep claimed her. The following days were filled with preparations for the building bees. Word came from town that the Packards' new home was underway, with most of the men from the surrounding area pitching in. Eliza's rebuild would begin the following week, and Martha kept her busy preparing food for the workers, baking bread, smoking hams, and putting up preserves to feed the volunteers. Preston was often absent, overseeing the cutting and preparation of lumber from his pine stand. When he did return to the house, he brought updates on the progress, and sometimes small treasures he'd found while clearing Eliza's property: a tarnished silver spoon, a relatively undamaged teacup, a small framed sampler that Eliza's mother had made as a girl. Each recovered item was presented without fanfare, usually left on the kitchen table with a brief explanation of where it had been found. But Eliza recognized these gestures for what they were: acts of kindness, meant to restore some small part of what she had lost. On the Friday before her building bee was to begin, Preston returned from town with unexpected news. "The banks approved loans for flood victims," he announced during dinner. "Special terms, low interest, extended repayment. You should talk to Willoughby first thing Monday." Eliza's heart leapt at this news. A loan would mean she could properly restock her farm, perhaps even expand beyond what she'd had before. "That's wonderful news," she said. "I was worried about how to afford livestock after rebuilding." "Already taken care of," Preston said, cutting into his steak. "You'll have 2 milk cows and a dozen chickens to start. Breeding pair of pigs too if you want them." Eliza stared at him, fork suspended halfway to her mouth. "What do you mean, taken care of?" Martha suddenly became very interested in her plate, while Preston continued eating as if his statement wasn't extraordinary. "The valley's putting together a livestock pool for those who lost animals in the flood," he explained matter-of-factly. "Each ranch is contributing what they can spare. You're on the list to receive. And I suppose you had nothing to do with organizing this pool?" Eliza asked, suspicion mingling with gratitude. Preston's eyes met hers briefly. "Might have suggested it to a few people." "Preston Cole," she said, setting down her fork, "you are the most infuriatingly humble man I've ever met." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, followed by something that might have been amusement. "Just practical, Miss Morgan. Valley needs its farms as much as its ranches." Martha cleared her throat. "The pie's cooling in the pantry. Shall I serve it now?" The moment passed, but throughout the remainder of the meal, Eliza found herself watching Preston with new eyes. His kindness extended far beyond what obligation or neighborliness required. There was something more at work here, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it might be. That night, unable to sleep, she slipped downstairs for a glass of water. The house was quiet, but a thin line of light shone beneath the door of Preston's study. On impulse, she knocked softly. "Come in," his deep voice called. She opened the door to find him at his desk, ledgers spread before him, a lamp burning low beside an almost empty glass of whiskey. He looked up, surprise evident in his expression when he saw her. "Eliza, is something wrong?" It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. "No," she assured him. "I couldn't sleep and saw your light. I'm sorry to disturb you." "You're not disturbing me," he said, closing the ledger. "Just finishing some accounts." She hesitated in the doorway, suddenly unsure why she had sought him out. "I wanted to thank you again, for everything you've done." Preston shook his head slightly. "You've thanked me enough." "No," she insisted, stepping into the room. "I don't think I have. You saved my life, gave me work and shelter when I had nowhere to go, and now you're helping rebuild my home and restock my farm. It's extraordinary." He looked uncomfortable with her praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "We both know that's not true," Eliza said softly. "Most people would have done the minimum that decency required. You've gone far beyond that." Preston rose from his chair, moving to the window to look out at the darkness. "Perhaps I understand what it means to lose everything," he said after a moment. "To have to start over with nothing but determination, and whatever help comes your way." Eliza moved to stand beside him, close enough to catch the faint scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to him. "Tell me," she requested quietly. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't respond. Then, his voice low, he began to speak. "I was 15 when the typhoid took my parents. Within a month, I lost them both and our home in Missouri. The farm was sold to pay debts. All I had left was the horse my father had given me for my birthday and whatever I could carry in a single bag." He paused, his gaze fixed on some point in the distance. "My uncle brought me west. He was a hard man, not given to sentiment, but he gave me a place to live and work, taught me ranching. When he died 7 years later, he left me this place such as it was then. Not much more than a shack and a few dozen head of cattle." "You built all this yourself," Eliza said, understanding dawning. "From almost nothing." Preston nodded. "With help. Had good hands who stayed loyal even when I could barely pay them, neighbors who pitched in during those first hard years. A banker who took a chance on a young man with more ambition than collateral." He turned to look at her then, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. "I never forgot what that meant to have help when you need it most." Eliza's heart swelled with emotion. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his face, her fingers light against his cheek. "Thank you for telling me." He went very still at her touch, his eyes searching hers. For a breathless moment, she thought he might pull away or perhaps draw her closer. Instead, he gently captured her hand in his and lowered it, though he didn't immediately let go. "It's late," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day." Reluctantly, Eliza nodded. "Good night, Preston." "Good night, Eliza." As she made her way back to her room, her hand still tingling from his touch, Eliza realized with startling clarity that what she felt for Preston Cole had grown far beyond gratitude or friendship. Somewhere in these weeks of shared meals and quiet conversations, of witnessed kindnesses and discovered depths, she had begun to fall in love with him. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. What place could there be for such feelings? She was preparing to leave, to return to her own home once it was rebuilt, and Preston had given no indication that he saw her as anything more than a neighbor in need or a temporary employee. Yet there had been something in his eyes tonight, a warmth, a connection that went beyond mere courtesy. Or perhaps she was simply seeing what she wanted to see. Sleep eluded her for hours as she turned these thoughts over in her mind. The building B for Eliza's new home began at dawn the following Saturday. She rode with Preston to her property, where they found nearly 24 men already gathered, along with wagons loaded with lumber, tools, and supplies. Women from neighboring farms had set up a cooking area, preparing to feed the workers throughout the day. The sight brought tears to Eliza's eyes. "I never expected so many," she whispered. Preston smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his face. "Told you the valley looks after its own." Throughout the day, Eliza alternated between helping with the cooking and watching the miraculous transformation of her property. By midday, the foundation had been cleared and prepared. By mid-afternoon, the frame of the house was taking shape, men calling to each other as they hoisted beams and secured joists. Preston worked alongside them, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms as he hammered and sawed with obvious expertise. Eliza found her gaze drawn to him repeatedly, admiring his strength and the easy way he coordinated with the other men. Occasionally, he would glance her way, offering a quick smile or nod before returning to his task. As the sun began to set, the shell of the house stood complete, walls framed, roof beams in place. It was larger than her original home, with an extra bedroom and a more spacious kitchen. Work would continue through the week, with smaller crews returning to finish the roof, install windows and doors, and complete the interior. The workers gathered for a final meal as twilight deepened, tired but satisfied with their day's accomplishments. Eliza moved among them, offering thanks and serving coffee, her heart full to bursting with gratitude. "You'll be back in your own home before you know it," Martha commented as they packed up the cooking supplies. "Though we'll miss you at the ranch." "I'll miss you too," Eliza replied, suddenly realizing how true that was. In just a few weeks, the ranch had begun to feel like home, and the thought of leaving brought an unexpected pang of sadness. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both Eliza and Preston lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the barn, he helped her dismount, his hands lingering slightly longer than necessary at her waist. "Thank you for today," she said, looking up at him in the lantern light. "For everything." "You're welcome," he replied, his voice low. He seemed about to say more, then simply nodded and turned to tend to the horses. Eliza made her way to the house, wondering at the sense of opportunity missed. The following week passed in a blur of activity. Eliza spent her days at her new house, helping with whatever tasks she could manage, hanging curtains sewn by neighboring women, arranging the few salvaged possessions and new items donated to replace what was lost, planning where her garden would be replanted. Preston rode over each day to check on progress, often bringing additional supplies or small items he thought might be useful: a set of hooks for the kitchen, a sturdy rocking chair for the porch, flower seeds for the garden. Each gift was presented casually, as if it were of no consequence, but Eliza recognized them for the thoughtful gestures they were. By Friday, the house was nearly complete. Windows gleamed in the afternoon sun, a new stone chimney rose from the shingled roof, and a freshly built porch wrapped around two sides of the structure. Inside, the floors were smooth plank, the walls whitewashed and clean. "It's wonderful," Eliza told Preston as they stood in what would be her bedroom. "Better than before in many ways." "You'll move in tomorrow?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Yes," she confirmed, though the prospect now filled her with mixed emotions. "Everything's ready, and I shouldn't impose on your hospitality any longer." "You haven't been an imposition," he said quickly, then added more quietly, "The house will seem empty without you." Eliza's heart quickened at his words. "I'll only be a few miles away," she reminded him. "And I still owe you for all your help." "You owe me nothing," Preston insisted. "Nevertheless," she pressed, "I hope you'll visit. Perhaps for Sunday dinner once I'm settled." A smile touched his lips. "I'd like that." That evening, Martha prepared a special meal to mark Eliza's last night at the ranch. The housekeeper had tears in her eyes as she served Eliza's favorite dishes: roast chicken with sage dressing, buttered carrots, and apple cobbler for dessert. "You must promise to visit often," Martha insisted, pressing Eliza's hand. "The kitchen won't be the same without you." "I will," Eliza promised, her own eyes growing moist. "And you must come see my new home once it's properly set up." Preston was quieter than usual during the meal, though he made an effort to participate in the conversation. When Martha excused herself to fetch the coffee, a brief silence fell between them. "I've been thinking," Preston said after a moment, "about your livestock." "Yes?" Eliza prompted when he paused. "The cows and chickens will be delivered tomorrow, but they'll need proper housing. I thought I might bring some hands over next week to build a small barn and chicken coop." "That's very generous," Eliza said, "but surely you've done enough already." Preston met her eyes directly. "I don't mind doing more." Something in his gaze made her breath catch. Before she could respond, Martha returned with the coffee pot, and the moment was lost. Later, as Eliza packed her few belongings in preparation for the move, there was a soft knock at her door. She opened it to find Preston standing there, holding a small wrapped package. "I wanted to give you this," he said, extending the package toward her. "A housewarming gift." Curious, Eliza unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a beautiful leather-bound journal, its cover tooled with a design of wildflowers. "Preston, it's lovely," she breathed, running her fingers over the intricate pattern. "I noticed you writing sometimes in the evenings," he explained. "Your old journal was lost in the flood, I thought." "Thank you," she said, touched by his thoughtfulness. "I'll treasure it," he nodded, seeming relieved by her reaction. "Well, good night then. I'll have the wagon ready after breakfast to take you and your things to your new home." "Good night, Preston," she replied, fighting the urge to ask him to stay a little longer. After he left, she sat on the edge of her bed, holding the journal and wondering why leaving felt so much like loss when she was finally regaining her independence. Morning came too quickly. Breakfast was a subdued affair, with Martha fussing over whether Eliza had enough provisions to last until she could get to town for supplies. Preston said little, but ensured that the wagon was loaded with everything Eliza might need for her first days in the new house: food, linens, tools, even a cat from the barn to keep mice at bay. The journey to her new home took less than an hour. As they crested the final rise, and the house came into view solid and welcoming in the morning sun, Eliza felt a surge of both pride and trepidation. Preston helped her unload her belongings and settle in, making sure the stove was working properly and that she had enough firewood stacked by the door. Martha had packed a basket with enough food for several days, and neighbors had contributed additional supplies: sacks of flour and sugar, preserved fruits, even a few chickens already installed in a temporary pen until their proper coop could be built. "Is there anything else you need?" Preston asked as the last items were brought inside. Eliza looked around at her new home, filled with evidence of the community's generosity. I don't think so. You've all thought of everything. He nodded, his expression unreadable. I'll come by Monday with the men to start on the barn. I'll have dinner waiting, she promised. An awkward silence fell between them, neither quite knowing how to say goodbye after weeks of daily interaction. Finally, Preston picked up his hat from the table. Well, I should get back. Ranch won't run itself. Of course, Eliza said, walking him to the door. Thank you again, Preston, for everything. He paused on the threshold, looking down at her with an intensity that made her heart race. For a breathless moment, she thought he might say something more, might even take her in his arms. Instead, he simply nodded, placed his hat on his head, and stepped outside. Sunday dinner, he said, turning back briefly. I'll be here. I'll be waiting, she replied softly. As she watched him drive away, Eliza felt a curious mixture of emotions: gratitude for all he had done, happiness at being in her new home, and a wistful longing for what might have been if circumstances had been different. That night, lying in her new bed, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and settling sounds of her house, Eliza realized how much she missed the quiet security of the ranch. Not just the comfortable room or Martha's motherly presence, but the knowledge that Preston was nearby, solid and dependable. She opened the journal he had given her and began to write, pouring out her confused feelings onto the blank pages. By the time she finally drifted off to sleep, she had come to a realization: whatever her future held, she wanted Preston Cole to be part of it. The question was whether he felt the same. Sunday dawned clear and bright. Eliza spent the morning cleaning and arranging her new home, then preparing a special meal for Preston's visit: roast beef with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread, and a berry pie made from preserves Martha had sent with her. As the appointed hour approached, she changed into her best dress, a blue calico that Martha had helped her make during her stay at the ranch, and arranged her hair with special care. Looking in the small mirror above her washstand, she barely recognized the woman who gazed back at her, cheeks flushed with anticipation, eyes bright with hope. She heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching and hurried to the window. Preston rode into view, looking more formal than usual in a clean white shirt and dark vest. He'd even trimmed his beard, she noticed as he dismounted and tied Samson to the hitching post. Taking a deep breath to calm her fluttering nerves, Eliza opened the door before he could knock. Right on time, she greeted him with a smile. Dinner's almost ready. Preston removed his hat as he stepped inside, his eyes taking in the transformed interior of the house. Place looks good, he commented. You've made it your own already. I'm trying, she replied, taking his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. It feels more like home each day. An unexpected shadow crossed his face at her words, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Something smells mighty good, he said, following her to the kitchen. Dinner passed pleasantly, with conversation flowing more easily than Eliza had expected. Preston told her about a new foal born at the ranch the previous night, and she shared her plans for the garden she would plant now that the weather was settled. The soil here is good, Preston noted, glancing out the window at the cleared area behind the house. Better than at your old place, actually. Less rocky. That's what Mr. Henderson said when he came by yesterday, Eliza agreed. He thinks I might be able to expand beyond what I grew before, maybe even plant some fruit trees along the south side. Good idea, Preston nodded. I could bring some saplings from the orchard at the ranch. Got some good varieties that do well in this climate. I'd appreciate that, Eliza said, warmed by his continued willingness to help. After they finished eating, Preston insisted on helping with the dishes, a domestic scene that felt surprisingly natural. Their hands occasionally brushed as they worked side by side, each contact sending a jolt of awareness through Eliza. When the kitchen was tidy, she suggested they take coffee on the porch to enjoy the late afternoon sunshine. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the play of light and shadow across the valley. "It's peaceful here," Preston observed, his deep voice matching the tranquility of the moment. "Yes," Eliza agreed, "though I must admit I've missed the company at the ranch." He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "The offer still stands, you know, if you ever decide you'd prefer not to live alone." Eliza's heart skipped a beat. "The job at the ranch, you mean?" Preston set down his coffee cup, his movements deliberate. "That too," he said carefully, "but I was thinking of something more permanent." She hardly dared breathe, afraid to misinterpret his words. "What exactly are you offering, Preston?" He turned to face her fully, his blue eyes serious. "I'm not good with words, Eliza, never have been. But these past weeks, having you at the ranch—" He paused, seeming to search for the right way to continue. "The place felt different, better." Hope blossomed in her chest. "It felt that way to me too." Encouraged, Preston reached for her hand, enfolding it in his larger one. "I know it hasn't been long, some might say it's too soon, but I've never been more certain of anything." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "I'm asking if you might consider a different arrangement, a permanent one, as my wife." Joy surged through Eliza, so intense it momentarily robbed her of speech. She stared at him, taking in the vulnerability in his normally stoic expression, the hopeful uncertainty in his eyes. "Preston," she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I am," he confirmed, a hint of anxiety creeping into his tone as her silence stretched. "I understand if you need time to consider or if your answer is no." "I know I'm not." Eliza stopped his words by placing her fingers gently against his lips. "Yes," she said simply. "My answer is yes." For a moment he seemed unable to process her response. Then his face transformed with a smile of such genuine happiness that it took her breath away. "Yes," he repeated, as if needing confirmation. "Yes," she said again, laughing now. "I would be honored to be your wife." Preston's hand tightened around hers, and with his free hand, he reached up to touch her cheek. "Eliza," he murmured, her name on his lips like a prayer. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tender and respectful, but with an underlying current of emotion that made Eliza's heart soar. When they parted, she kept her eyes closed for a moment, savoring the feeling. "I've wanted to do that since the day I pulled you from the flood," Preston admitted, his voice rough with feeling. Eliza opened her eyes to find him watching her with undisguised affection. "I'm glad you finally did," she replied softly. They spent the remainder of the afternoon making plans. Preston wanted a short engagement if Eliza was agreeable. The ranch house had plenty of room, and Martha would be delighted to have Eliza return permanently. "What about this place?" Eliza asked, gesturing to her newly built home. "After everyone worked so hard to rebuild it." "It won't go to waste," Preston assured her. "My foreman, Frank, is looking to marry soon. He and his bride could live here, look after your livestock and garden. You could still visit whenever you wanted." The solution was perfect, allowing Eliza to maintain a connection to the home while beginning a new life with Preston. They decided on a June wedding, just 4 weeks away, with a simple ceremony at the church in town, followed by a celebration at the ranch. As twilight deepened and Preston reluctantly prepared to leave, he kissed her once more, this time with greater confidence and a hint of the passion that simmered beneath his controlled exterior. "I'll be back tomorrow with the men to start on the barn," he promised, holding her close. "And to speak with the preacher about our wedding." Eliza nodded, reluctant to let him go but knowing he had responsibilities at the ranch. "I'll be here." She watched him ride away, her heart fuller than she could have imagined possible just a few short weeks ago. The flood that had nearly claimed her life had instead swept her toward a future brighter than any she had dared to dream. That night, Eliza wrote in her new journal, recording the events of the day and her hopes for the future. As she closed the leather cover, her fingers tracing the tooled wildflowers, she thought about how life could change in an instant, how disaster could lead to blessing, how loss could open the door to something new and wonderful. The next month passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Word of their engagement spread quickly through the valley, met with universal approval and not a little satisfaction from those who claimed to have seen it coming all along. Martha wept with joy when they told her, immediately beginning plans for the wedding feast and improvements to the master bedroom of the ranch house. Frank, the foreman, was equally pleased when Preston offered him the use of Eliza's new house, confessing that he had indeed been courting a young woman in town, but had hesitated to propose without a proper home to offer her. Eliza divided her time between her new house, where she continued setting up a home that would soon be Frank's, and the ranch, where she began making subtle changes to prepare for her role as Preston's wife. She and Martha sorted through linens and dishware, deciding what should be replaced or updated. Preston gave her free rein, seeming pleased by her interest in making the ranch house more of a home. In the evenings, when his work was done, Preston would ride over to Eliza's place, where they would sit on the porch and talk about their future together. He spoke of his plans for the ranch, his hopes to expand their cattle operation and perhaps breed horses more extensively. Eliza shared her ideas for enlarging the kitchen garden at the ranch, perhaps even starting a small orchard similar to what she had planned for her own property. "I never expected this," Preston admitted one evening as they watched the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. "After my parents died, I figured I'd spend my life working the land, maybe build something worth passing on someday. Never thought much about who I'd pass it to." "And now?" Eliza asked, her hand nestled in his. A slow smile spread across his face. "Now I'm thinking maybe we'll need to add a nursery to the house before too long." The image of their children running through the ranch house, learning to ride on gentle ponies, helping with garden and livestock, filled Eliza with a deep contentment. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Very much." On their wedding day, the small church in Willow Creek was filled to capacity. It seemed everyone in the valley had come to witness the union of the quiet rancher who had built his spread from nearly nothing, and the determined young woman who had survived the devastating flood. Eliza wore a dress of ivory silk, a gift from Martha and the other women of the valley, who had pooled their resources to purchase the fabric and worked together to sew it. Her dark hair was arranged with sprigs of wildflowers, and she carried a bouquet of the same blooms that Preston had ridden miles to collect that morning. Preston waited for her at the altar, looking both nervous and proud in a new black suit. When Eliza appeared at the back of the church, his expression transformed with such naked adoration that whispers rippled through the congregation. The ceremony was brief, but heartfelt. They exchanged simple gold bands and traditional vows, though Preston surprised Eliza by adding a few words of his own. "I promise to be the man you can always count on," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the hushed church. "The one who will ride through any flood to reach you, who will help you rebuild whatever falls, who will cherish every day we're given together." Tears shimmered in Eliza's eyes as she responded, "And I promise to be the woman who stands beside you through all seasons, who makes a home wherever we are together, who loves you with every breath I take." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Preston's kiss was tender but thorough, prompting good-natured cheers from their friends and neighbors. The celebration at the ranch lasted well into the evening. Tables were set up in the yard, laden with food contributed by everyone in the community. There was music and dancing, laughter and tears, as the valley celebrated not just a wedding but the resilience of their community in the face of nature's fury. As the last guests departed, Preston and Eliza stood on the porch of what was now their home, watching lanterns bobbing away into the darkness. "Happy, Mrs. Cole?" Preston asked, his arm secure around her waist. Eliza leaned into him, savoring the solid strength of him beside her. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied truthfully. Later, in the privacy of their bedroom now transformed with new curtains, a handmade quilt, and fresh flowers in a crystal vase, Preston's tender passion confirmed what his words and actions had already shown, that his love for her ran as deep and true as the foundations of the life they would build together. In the years that followed, the valley saw many changes. Eliza's former homestead thrived under Frank's care, especially after he married his sweetheart and they began raising a family there. The Cole Ranch expanded, becoming one of the most prosperous operations in the county, known for its fine horses as well as its cattle. Eliza and Preston welcomed 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter who grew strong and capable in the shadow of the mountains, learning the values their parents held dear: hard work, honesty, and the importance of helping others in need. Each spring, when the river rose with melting snow from the mountains, Preston would ride out to check the flood markers he had installed throughout the valley, an early warning system designed to prevent another disaster like the one that had nearly claimed Eliza's life. And each year, when the waters receded without incident, they would ride together to the spot where he had found her clinging to that porch post, to give thanks for the flood that had nearly taken everything, but had instead given them each other. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, as they stood on that spot now part of a lush meadow with no trace of the destruction that had once been, Preston presented Eliza with a gift: a small silver pendant in the shape of a horse, intricately detailed and hanging from a delicate chain. "To remind you," he said as he fastened it around her neck, "that I'll always ride through whatever waters rise to bring you safely home." Eliza touched the pendant, then reached up to trace the lines that a decade of Colorado sun and wind had etched around her husband's eyes. "And to remind me," she replied, "that sometimes what seems like the end is really just the beginning." As they rode back to the ranch, side by side as they had been for 10 years, Eliza reflected on how a single moment could change the course of a life, how the raging floodwaters that had threatened to claim her had instead carried her to the shores of a love deeper and more enduring than any she could have imagined. And in the years to come, when their children asked for the story of how their parents met, Preston would always begin with the same words: "It was the spring of '75, and the rains had been falling for days."